Burmese Days is a novel written by George Orwell. His birth name was Eric Arthur Blair. He was born in British Motihari, Drag in June 25, 1903, and he died in January 21, 1950, in London, the United Kingdom.
He was a famous writer and journalist, and all his work were marked by potential experience that were divided in three periods. First, his opposition against the British imperialism, that made him a representative of the colonial order in Burmese. The next period is when he was with the democratic socialism, and finally against the totalitarianism, Nazis, and Stalinism.
Other books from the same author are 1984, Animal Farm, Coming Up for Air, Keep the Apidistra Flying, A Clergyman's Daughter, and Burmese Days.
The first publication was in 1934. This novel was based in the 5 years that Orwell lived in Burma and worked in the police. That book was based on real characters and a real situation that the author lived.
The editors were reluctant to publish that book because they feared a demand. This fear was because in the time where the book was written and takes place were the last years of the British imperialism, before the World War II, and it could carry the editorial trouble by publishing it. However, it was finally published and no retired officer demands them. However, Orwell have to change some names.
Pippa King is a clever man with impressive skills of manipulation, and he managed to enter to the European Club. Stuart Lackenstern is a local manager of a timber firm. He is simple-minded and dedicated to pursuit of pleasure. As such, he is often drunk. Rory, an European man with sallow skin and a dark birthmark on his face. He is lonely, and he thinks that Elizabeth Lackenstern is the answer to the Latin problem, but then she dumps him and he eventually commits suicide. Dr. Beraswamy. He is a village doctor. While Burmese, he admires the European-centered culture and thinks they are good for Burma. Mrs. Lackenstern, the wife of Mr. Lackenstern and aunt of Elizabeth. Elizabeth Lackenstern, a woman who comes to Burma to stay with her aunt and uncle after her mother dies. She wants to marry an European in Burma and considers Florey before becoming disgusted by his birthmark and favorable treatment towards the natives. She hopes to marry the pretentious Burwell, but ends up with Mr. McGregor. She becomes a perfect example of a white woman in a colonial empire, imperious and prejudiced. Burwell, a handsome, cold and arrogant young man sent to Kiaktara to head the military police. He romances Elizabeth but leaves the colony after a month with no marriage proposal or even a goodbye.
We can understand this story in a very brief way understanding next. There are two parts with different opinions about the British Empire that are the Dr. Berswami and Upon King. They are on a club and they are trying to defeat each other. Then we have Florey, that doesn't care so much about politics and he's alone because he has a very strange birthmark. Actually, he has a lover, but he doesn't feel anything about her. But then he meets Elizabeth. She hates the native of Burma and Florey defends them. However, they fell in love and because of an earthquake, Elizabeth falling in love with another guy, the plans of wedding of Florey were broken. So she leaves Florey and he got depressed. Then he lived and in his return he fight for what he think it was right and again make Elizabeth fell in love with him. He also success in a club and that make that Dr. Berswami wants to destroy him and certainly did lifting him about anything and so destroyed that he eventually committed suicide.
The first theme that we can see is imperialism, and we can relate it to this quote. The point was the doctor the kind of man who would hold seditious opinions? In India you are not judged for what you do, but for what you are. Burmese Days. This quote makes the problems that the British imperialism dealt with remarkable, and as a Upon King notes, The only thing that mattered was appearance and assumption. If people hold an opinion, it doesn't matter if it was based in a fact or not.
But the whole expedition, the very notion of wanting the rubbed shoulders with all those smelly natives, had impressed her badly. She was perfectly certain that that was not how white men ought to behave. This quote explained the mentality of Elizabeth. She felt uncomfortable about being too close to the natives. These sentiments are based on her beliefs of how the races should interact with each other, and these beliefs can be hardly changed.
The next quote that we are going to see is related to the gender, and it goes like this. But worse than that, worse than anything, was his ugliness at this moment. His face appalled her. It was so ghastly, rigid, and old. It was like a skull. Only the birthmark seemed alive in it. She hated him now for his birthmark. She had never known till this moment how dishonoring, how unforgivable a thing it was. This quote refers to the most sad part of the book. However, this quote makes visible that Elizabeth convinced herself that marrying Flory was perhaps the only option, and Elizabeth is a good example of how the mentality of the woman was. They think that marriage have incalculable value.